winds howled through the barren landscape. The earth beneath his feet cracked and dry, a reminder of the harsh world he now called home. A man, solitary and weathered by years of surviving in isolation, walked the desolate expanse with nothing but the sound of his footsteps and the rustling of the wind to accompany him. His existence had become routine: wake up, forage, survive, repeat. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, he found himself growing restless, as if a quiet yearning for something beyond mere survival stirred within him. It was during one of his routine trips out into the wilds that he stumbled upon something that would change his life forever. There, in the distance, lying motionless upon the cracked ground, was a form unlike anything he had ever seen. His heart skipped a beat, the stillness of the scene sending a cold shiver down his spine. He approached cautiously, unsure of what to make of the sight. The figure was small, fragile, almost delicate in appearance. As he drew nearer, he saw that it wasn't a creature he had ever encountered on this planet. It wasn't human. It was something else entirely. A girl, though she looked unlike any human he had known. Her skin shimmered with an otherworldly glow, tinged with hues that shifted in the light, like the surface of a distant moon. Her hair was long and silver, flowing around her face in delicate strands that seemed to defy gravity. And her eyes, when they flickered open just enough to meet his gaze, were a deep shade of violet that seemed to hold the weight of a universe in them. She was beautiful, but in a way that was both alien and familiar, as if she didn't belong but had somehow found her way to this planet anyway. His heart raced as he knelt beside her, unsure of what to do. Her breathing was shallow, labored. It was clear that she was dying. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. What could he possibly do to save her? He was just a man, alone in a world that didn't seem to care if he lived or died. Yet, in that moment, something inside him stirred. Something deep within urged him to act, to try, even if it seemed impossible. The alien girl's hand twitched, and her eyes fluttered open again. She looked at him with an expression that seemed both grateful and fearful. Her voice, when it came, was weak, barely more than a whisper. "Help me." The words struck him hard. It was an instinctive response, a pull to do something, anything, to save her. But what could he do? He wasn't a healer, and the world around them offered nothing in the way of resources that could help an alien, especially one so unlike anything he had ever seen. He knew he had to try, though. There was no other choice. He could either turn his back on her and walk away, or he could face the impossible and try to save the life of a creature that seemed to come from another world. He couldn't leave her there to die. Not like this. As he carefully lifted her into his arms, the weight of the responsibility hit him. She was so fragile, her small body limp against his chest, as if the very life had been drained from her. He knew she didn't have much time left. Every second counted. His mind raced, wondering what he could possibly do. The world around them was nothing but desolation, with no hope of medical help or technology that could save her. But there was something inside him that refused to give up, something that would not let him fail. He began the long trek back to his cabin, the alien girl's fragile form cradled in his arms. The journey was slow, each step measured with care. His thoughts were a whirlwind, bouncing between desperation and determination. What had happened to her? Was she from another world, as her appearance suggested? If so, what had brought her here, to this barren, dying place? And how could he help her when everything around him was so devoid of life and resources? The questions plagued him, but he pushed them aside for now. There was only one thing that mattered. He had to save her. He didn't know how, but he couldn't just stand by and watch her die. As the hours passed, he grew more and more concerned. The girl's breathing had become even more shallow, her body growing colder with each passing moment. He knew that if he didn't act fast, it would be too late. But still, he pressed on, refusing to let the fear take hold of him. He had seen death before, many times, but this was different. There was something about her, something that made him believe she was worth fighting for, even if it seemed hopeless. Finally, he reached the cabin, his legs aching with the strain of carrying her so far. He gently laid her on the bed, his hands shaking as he tried to think of what to do next. He had no medical knowledge, no training. All he had was the will to try, to do whatever it took to save her. He rummaged through his small collection of supplies, grabbing anything that might help. But nothing seemed to make sense for what she needed. He didn't know what she was, where she came from, or what had happened to her. The only thing he knew was that he had to act fast, or she would slip away from him. As the hours passed and the night stretched on, the man fought against the creeping sense of helplessness. He knew time was running out. The girl's life hung by a thread, and he was the only one who could do anything about it. But how could he save an alien from another world? What did she need to survive? In that moment of desperation, he realized something. It wasn't just about saving her life. It was about understanding her, connecting with her in a way that went beyond the physical. He had to learn about her, about who she was and what had brought her here. Maybe then he could find a way to help her, to give her the chance to survive. But with every passing moment, he feared that it would be too late. As the girl's breathing grew fainter, he couldn't help but wonder if his chance to save her was already slipping away. Would he fail her, just like he had failed so many others in the past? Or could he somehow find a way to save her, to save them both, and unlock the secrets of her mysterious origin before it was too late? The air in the cabin was thick with tension as the man hovered over the alien girl, her faint breaths the only sound in the room. He had set her down gently on the bed, careful not to harm her fragile form. The pale light of the moon filtered through the small window, casting a cold glow on the strange, almost ethereal markings etched across her skin. They seemed to pulse softly, as if they held some kind of life force within them, but the man couldn't tell if it was a sign of vitality or something far more ominous. Every time her body shuddered with a shallow breath, his heart skipped a beat, torn between hope and the nagging fear that it might be too late. His mind raced as he tried to recall anything that could help him in this situation. Could she be from another planet? It seemed impossible, but then again, what else could explain her appearance? Her skin, shimmering with an iridescent glow, her otherworldly features, she was not from Earth, that much was clear. But how had she ended up here, on this barren, forgotten world? The man had spent years alone in the desolate wilderness, but he had never encountered anything like this. Not even the wild creatures that roamed the land were so strange. He had heard stories, whispered rumors of alien sightings, but none had ever seemed credible. And yet, here she was, lying in front of him, on the brink of death. His gaze lingered on her face. Despite her weakness, she was undeniably beautiful in a way that was almost surreal. Her silver hair cascaded across the pillow, framing her delicate features. Her violet eyes, though clouded with pain, still held an unsettling intelligence, as if she knew far more than she was letting on. She was an enigma, a puzzle that his mind couldn't quite piece together. The sense of responsibility that had gripped him earlier was now accompanied by a deep curiosity. What was she? Where had she come from? And most pressing of all, how could he save her? He glanced around the cabin, the small space filled with sparse furniture and the remnants of a solitary life. There was nothing here that could offer him the answers he needed. He didn't have the tools, the knowledge, or the resources to heal an alien creature. But something within him refused to give up. He couldn't just let her slip away into the darkness, not when he had the chance to help. The human part of him, his survival instincts, his compassion drove him to keep trying, to keep searching for a solution. The girl's breath rattled, a soft cough escaping her lips. The man knelt beside her again, his hands trembling as he reached for her, unsure if she could even feel him. Her skin was unnaturally cold, the chill seeping into his fingertips as he touched her arm. A strange pulse throbbed beneath the surface, but it wasn't a heartbeat, more like a faint hum, a vibration that didn't belong to anything human. His pulse quickened at the thought, and he carefully brushed her hair back from her face, his breath shaky. "Hang on," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Please, just hold on." But even as the words left his lips, doubt gnawed at him. What could he possibly do for someone so alien? His mind raced back to the few things he knew about extraterrestrials. He had read stories, seen old films, but they were all just that, stories. Nothing like this had ever been documented, at least not in any credible way. He had nothing to go on except instinct, and that, he feared, might not be enough. As he sat there, watching her, his thoughts wandered back to the day he had found her. The sky had been overcast, clouds swirling in patterns that didn't seem natural. He had been out searching for food, another exhausting day in the endless cycle of survival. It wasn't until he spotted something unusual, a streak of light cutting across the sky, that he thought anything was out of the ordinary. At first, he had dismissed it as some natural phenomenon, a shooting star perhaps. But then the ground beneath him had rumbled, sending a tremor through the earth that nearly knocked him off his feet. And there, in the distance, amidst the jagged rocks and arid land, he had seen her, a small, fragile figure lying unconscious, as if dropped from the sky. He had approached cautiously, hesitant at first, unsure of what he was seeing. But as he neared, the sight of her had struck him with an overwhelming sense of urgency. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, or that she was unlike anything he had ever seen. No, it was something more. Something deep within him told him that she needed help. And so, against every instinct telling him to turn away, he had reached out. Now, in the dim light of his cabin, he found himself struggling with the same overwhelming sense of helplessness. A sudden movement interrupted his thoughts. The girl's eyelids fluttered open, her violet eyes barely visible, but there was a flicker of recognition in them. She seemed to sense his presence, her gaze locking onto his. The man froze, unsure of what to do next. Her lips parted, and a weak, strained voice escaped her. "Water," she whispered, barely audible. His heart raced. He had no idea if water would help her, but he knew he couldn't ignore her request. He stood quickly and retrieved a small canteen from a shelf. His hand shook as he uncapped it and brought it to her lips. She took a small sip, the movement slow and labored, but it was something. Anything. As she drank, her eyes never left his, a silent connection forming between them that he couldn't explain. For a moment, they were suspended in time, the world outside fading into nothingness. It was just the two of them, alone in that small cabin, a man and an alien girl, bound by a strange twist of fate. The man's mind raced with questions. Who was she? What had happened to her? How had she ended up here, in the desolate wilderness, alone and dying? Her breath steadied slightly, as the water seemed to ease the parched dryness of her throat. But even then, it was clear she was far from recovered. She shifted slightly, and the man noticed the dark circles beneath her eyes, the pallor of her skin. She was fading fast, and no amount of water would change that. He wiped his brow, fighting the mounting panic that threatened to take over. There had to be something he could do. But what? What could a solitary man with no knowledge of alien biology or healing techniques do for someone like her? What if she had no chance of surviving? What if he had made a mistake by bringing her here? These thoughts swirled in his mind, but he shoved them aside. He couldn't afford to doubt now. With renewed determination, he reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I won't let you die," he promised, though he didn't know if those words had any real meaning. Still, they were the only thing he could offer her in this moment. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. As the girl's eyes closed once again, a deep sense of urgency settled in his chest. The journey ahead of him was unknown, and the road to saving her, if it was even possible, was fraught with uncertainty. But one thing was clear: he would do whatever it took. There was no turning back now. The silence in the room was oppressive, as if the very air itself held its breath, waiting for anything to happen. The man sat beside the girl, his hands trembling as he wiped the sweat from his brow. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but there was no room for panic. Not now. He needed to think clearly, to keep his focus. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, the questions gnawed at the back of his mind. Was it too late? Could he really save her? What if she wasn't just another survivor, but something far more dangerous? Something that could never be saved? The girl's condition hadn't improved. She still seemed so fragile, as if a gust of wind could carry her away. Each breath was a laborious effort, and the pale glow of her skin flickered dimly in the low light of the cabin. The faint hum beneath her skin, once a barely perceptible vibration, now pulsed erratically. The strange energy she seemed to radiate was only growing stronger. The man could feel it in his own chest, a rhythmic pulse in his bones that matched the one from her body. It wasn't just her life hanging in the balance anymore. Something much larger was at stake. He looked out the window, half expecting to see a ship or a fleet of alien vessels hovering in the sky, ready to reclaim her. But the skies remained still. The world outside was as empty and desolate as ever. No signs of life. No rescue. There was a sudden, sharp intake of breath from the girl, causing the man to snap his attention back to her. Her eyes fluttered open, but there was a strange emptiness in them now. The glowing purple of her irises seemed to flicker, as if the life force behind them was fading. Her lips parted, but the words that came out were more of a rasp than anything coherent. "Not enough time," she whispered weakly, her voice strained. His heart pounded in his chest. He leaned forward, gripping her hand tighter. "What do you mean? What's happening to you?" She gasped for breath, and for a moment he thought she might slip away entirely. He didn't know what he could do to stop it. His knowledge was limited, and nothing in his life had prepared him for this. He had survived by his instincts, but they were failing him now. Then, as if sensing his desperation, she managed a faint smile, one that seemed to hold a mix of sorrow and regret. "You can't save me, but you must protect it." Her words sent a chill down his spine. Protect what? Was she referring to herself? Or something else? The girl's hand squeezed his weakly, and she seemed to gather what little strength she had left. Her body arched slightly, and the light from the strange markings on her skin intensified, casting a glow across the room that made the shadows stretch unnaturally. The air around them seemed to thicken, as if reality itself was warping. He could feel the electricity in the air, the pulse of energy growing stronger with each passing second. Something was happening, something he didn't understand, but he could feel it deep in his bones. This was a moment that would define everything. "What do you mean?" His voice was desperate, rising with urgency. "What is it you want me to protect?" But the girl's eyes were already closing again, her breath shallow, as if the weight of her words had exhausted her. The silence in the cabin stretched long and painful. He didn't know what to do. The uncertainty was unbearable. His hands shook as he held her, unable to stop the flood of panic that threatened to overtake him. He didn't have the answers. He didn't even know if she could survive this. But one thing was clear. The girl, this alien, was more than just a survivor of some crash. She was important, integral to something bigger than either of them. That much he could feel. His thoughts raced. What had she meant by protected? Was she talking about her? Or was there something inside of her, some secret power or knowledge that needed to be safeguarded? He could sense that she was a key to something far beyond his understanding. The stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. Suddenly, the girl's body convulsed violently, and the light from her skin flared with such intensity that it lit up the entire cabin. The man stumbled backward, almost falling, as the pulse of energy surged through the room. His heart raced. Was this it? Was she dying, or was she transforming? The man reached out, trying to steady himself, but the intensity of the moment made it impossible to keep his bearings. He couldn't see clearly, only the blinding light and the unrelenting tremors. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the light receded. The air seemed to settle again, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. The girl was still lying there, but now her skin shimmered faintly, as though she'd been altered by the surge of energy. Her breathing had steadied, but she was still unconscious, her body now almost entirely still. The man's heart thundered in his chest as he approached her cautiously. Had she done it? Had she just awakened some dormant power inside herself? Or had she? "Please," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "What did you mean?" There was no answer, only silence, thick and heavy. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He didn't know how much time had passed since the surge of energy, but it felt as though the world had shifted in that instant. Something had changed, something irreversible. For a moment, he was paralyzed by indecision. He wasn't sure what was happening, or if anything could be done now to stop it. Could he still save her? Was there even time left? Or had he just witnessed the beginning of something far worse than he could imagine? His mind flashed back to her words. You must protect it. What was it? And why had she left him with nothing but a cryptic warning? Was the answer tied to the strange powers she had exhibited? Or was there something else at play? A noise from outside the cabin cut through his thoughts, a low rumble that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The man froze, his blood running cold. He knew that sound. It was the same tremor he had felt the day she had fallen from the sky. Something was coming. Something that could change everything. The man's hand instinctively reached for the small knife he kept by his side, his only weapon in this desolate world. Was it the girl's people? Had they come to reclaim her, or worse, to destroy him for having taken her in? The answer to that question was unclear, but one thing was certain. Whatever was out there, whatever was coming for them, was not going to stop. and neither would he. The rumble grew louder, shaking the very foundation of the cabin. His hand tightened around the knife, though he knew it would do little against whatever was coming. The noise outside was like a slow, steady roar, something monstrous and alive.
His heart pounded in his chest, faster with every passing second.
The girl, his only hope for understanding, lay motionless before him, her once glowing body now almost imperceptible in the dim light. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. It wasn't just the tremors of the earth that threatened to break him. Something was coming, something far beyond his comprehension. As much as he wanted to run, as much as he wanted to leave this place and escape whatever had drawn him here, he couldn't abandon her. Not now. Not after everything they had been through together. The noise outside began to intensify. It was no longer a distant rumble, but a cacophony of deep vibrations, each one seemingly more forceful than the last. The windows of the cabin rattled violently, and dust and debris swirled in the air as if the very world was being torn apart. He braced himself against the wall, his eyes never leaving the girl. He had no idea what was happening to her, or what she had become, but there was something he couldn't ignore, something primal, deep inside of him, that told him this wasn't just about saving her life anymore. It was about survival. His survival. Suddenly, the door to the cabin slammed open with a deafening crash, and a figure stood silhouetted in the frame. A tall, imposing figure, with eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. The man's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped into the cabin, the ground beneath its feet shaking with every movement. It was a being unlike anything he had seen before, its form alien yet unmistakably humanoid. Its eyes locked onto him, and for a moment he could feel the weight of its gaze, the raw power emanating from it. His instincts screamed at him to move, to flee, but his legs refused to obey. The figure stepped forward, and with each step, the air around them seemed to grow colder, the tension rising to an unbearable level. Then the figure spoke, its voice a low, rumbling sound that seemed to echo in the very bones of the man. "You have done well to protect her, human. But you have failed to understand what she is." The words sent a shiver through the man, but he refused to back down. His grip on the knife tightened, though he knew it was no use. Whatever this creature was, it was not something he could fight. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "What do you want with her?" The figure's eyes narrowed, and it took another step forward. "She is not just a survivor, human. She is the key to a much greater plan. And now, you are entangled in it, whether you wish it or not." The man's mind raced, trying to process the words. A key to what? What plan? And why had this being come for her now, after everything they had endured? Before he could speak again, the girl stirred. Her body shifted slightly, her breath quickening. The glowing light from her skin flickered once more, and then, just as the figure reached out toward her, her eyes snapped open. For a split second, everything went still. The man felt the world hold its breath, just as he had moments before. The girl's eyes locked onto the figure, and some shift in the air changed. The power that radiated from her intensified so sharply that it knocked the man back, sending him sprawling onto the floor. He gasped for air as a wave of energy surged outward from her, pushing the figure back toward the door. The alien figure staggered, its face a mix of surprise and something darker, something ancient. "No," it growled, its voice vibrating with the force of the energy that pulsed through the cabin. "You cannot control it. You cannot stop what has already begun." The man pushed himself up, his body trembling with the aftershock of the girl's energy. She was still weak, still fragile, but there was an undeniable force within her now, something far beyond human understanding. It was as if her very presence had altered the fabric of reality itself. The figure, still reeling from the shockwave, glared at her. Its eyes gleamed with hatred, but there was something else, too, fear. Fear of what she had become. Fear of what was coming. The girl's voice, weak but firm, finally broke the silence. You were never meant to control me. I was never meant to be your weapon. The man turned toward her, his heart racing. What was happening? What had she become? Was she speaking to this being as if she knew it? And more importantly, had she just freed herself from whatever influence it had held over her? The figure's expression darkened, its hands clenching into fists. You are a fool, it hissed. Do you think you can stop what has already been set in motion? You have no idea what you're dealing with, girl. You have no idea what you're about to unleash. The man took a cautious step forward, his eyes locked onto the figure. What are you talking about? What is she? The figure's lips curled into a sneer, and it raised a hand toward the girl, as if to strike. But before it could make contact, the air itself seemed to ripple, distorting with the power that surged from the girl. She stood now, her eyes glowing brighter than ever, the energy around her crackling like electricity. No more, she whispered. It ends here. In that instant, the cabin seemed to tremble once more, and the figure was thrown backward by an invisible force. It crashed into the wall, leaving cracks in the structure as it slumped to the ground. The man watched, his eyes wide in disbelief, as the creature struggled to rise. The girl stepped forward, her energy swirling around her like a storm. You think you can control me, but you never truly understood. I am not your weapon. I never was. The figure, now on the floor, reached up toward her, its voice barely a rasp. You have no idea what you're doing. This isn't over. There will be others. You cannot stop what is coming. But the girl merely shook her head. You're wrong. It's over for you. With a final surge of energy, she slammed her hand down, and the figure vanished into a burst of light, leaving only silence behind. The man stood there, stunned, as the glow from the girl began to dim. She collapsed into his arms, her strength finally giving out. He held her, unsure of what had just happened or what had truly changed in her. But for the first time since she had arrived, he felt a sliver of hope. She had done it. She had fought back. But the figure's warning lingered in his mind. There will be others. A deep, unsettling feeling gnawed at him. What had they just unleashed? And was it truly over? As the man cradled her, the world outside remained as still and silent as ever, but he knew the answer was far from clear. The air was still, but the weight of the silence pressed down on him as he held the girl in his arms, her breathing slow but steady. For a moment, it seemed as if the world had stopped. The tremors, the explosion of energy, the frightening figure, all of it seemed like it had never happened. As if the very fabric of reality had been altered in that instant, and now there was only this quiet, this fragile peace. He gently brushed her hair from her face, feeling the soft glow still emanating from her skin, though it was dimmer now. She had done it. She had fought back, defeated the entity that had been threatening them both. He wanted to believe it was over, that they were safe now. But something about the figure's final words still echoed in his mind. A chill ran down his spine as he pushed the thought away. He wasn't ready for this to unravel again. Not after everything they had been through. The girl stirred in his arms, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him, her expression weary but calm. "We did it," she whispered, her voice faint but full of conviction. "It's over." He nodded, though doubt still clung to his thoughts. "I think you're right," he said, his voice rough. "But there's something about all of this I can't shake. What exactly was that creature? And why did it say there would be more?" Her eyes softened, and she reached up to touch his cheek, her fingers warm against his skin. "It wasn't the last of them," she said quietly. "But it was the first of many who would have tried to use me, to control me. I was never meant to be a weapon for their war. And I'm not." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "I'm not the person they thought I was." The man couldn't help but frown, his mind racing. "Then what are you? What does this mean? You've got all this power inside you, but what happens now?" The girl hesitated, her gaze drifting to the broken walls of the cabin, the place where they had sought refuge just days ago. "I don't know," she said, her voice small but tinged with something fierce. "I don't know what happens next, but I know I can't stay here. I can't let them find me. Not like this." His heart clenched in his chest as he realized the weight of what she was saying. She wasn't just talking about them, the aliens who had tried to control her. She was talking about something far larger, something she was only beginning to understand herself. A threat that stretched beyond the confines of this world, beyond what either of them had ever known. "What are you going to do?" he asked softly, though part of him already feared the answer. She looked at him, her eyes filled with sorrow and determination. "I have to leave. I have to go find the others, those who are like me. If I stay here, if I stay with you, I'm not sure what that could mean for you. Or for me." He stared at her, his chest tightening at the thought of losing her, of everything they had been through coming to an end in this moment. He didn't know what would happen if she left. Would she be safe? Would she ever be able to control the power inside her? Or would it consume her, as it had almost consumed him? But he knew one thing for sure. He could never force her to stay. He couldn't cage her. Not when she was finally beginning to realize her own strength. "I'll help you," he said quietly, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. "Whatever it takes. I'll help you find the answers." She smiled faintly, her eyes soft with gratitude. "You don't understand, do you? It's not just about answers anymore. It's about survival. There's a war coming, and I'm not sure any of us are ready for it. But I know one thing, I can't face it alone. I need you. I need your strength." Her words were like a shock to his system. The weight of what she was asking settled over him, and the implications of everything they had faced, everything they still faced, loomed large in his mind. A war. He had never believed in anything like that. He had always lived in the quiet of his isolation, far removed from the chaos of the world. But now, that world was coming for him, and he couldn't outrun it. Not anymore. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I won't let you face it alone," he said, his voice firm. "But what are we supposed to do? How can we fight something like this?" Her gaze flickered with a mix of sadness and understanding. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know we'll have to try. Together. Whatever comes next, we can't run from it. It's too late for that now." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and inevitable. The future they had envisioned, the one that had seemed so clear before, was now shattered into 1,000 fragments. And all that remained was the unknown. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, A sudden noise outside broke the silence, a faint crackling sound, like the air itself was warping. His eyes widened as a shadow moved across the doorway. The light from the girl's glow flickered once again, and for a moment he thought he might be imagining it. But the shape grew larger, and with it, a new presence entered the cabin. Before he could react, the girl's voice cut through the tension. "They've found us," she whispered, her tone resigned. She stood, her eyes glowing brighter now, her power coiling around her like an electric current. "And this time, I'm ready." But just as the figure stepped forward from the shadows, another form appeared, this one. And just as quickly, the glowing figure shifted its stance, its expression wary but determined. The man couldn't believe his eyes. A human? How could they have known? "Stay back," the girl warned, her voice more forceful. "I won't let them take me again." The figure hesitated but raised its hands slowly, palms outward. "I'm not here to fight," the man said, his voice calm but laced with urgency. "I'm here to help." But before the words could settle, the ground beneath them shook again, this time more violently than before. And as the walls cracked and the ceiling groaned with the strain, they all realized one undeniable truth. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the fate of the world itself. As the tension reached its peak, the girl's power surged with an intensity that left the cabin shuddering. The man grabbed her arm, desperate to hold onto her. "Whatever happens next, don't lose yourself," he said. And with that final promise, everything exploded into chaos. The silence that enveloped the room felt heavy. The faint sound of breathing was all that filled the space now. As the last of the alien's energy drained, the man couldn't help but feel a pang of hopelessness. He had done everything in his power to save her, yet it seemed that nothing could stop her from fading away into nothingness. His hands trembled as he hovered over the frail form of the alien girl, now barely recognizable from the vibrant, powerful being she had been only moments ago. His mind raced. How had it come to this? He had never imagined that a chance encounter with an alien being would lead to such a life-or-death struggle. The bond they had formed was unexpected, something that transcended the strange nature of her arrival. It had felt like fate. He had seen her as a symbol of something greater, someone who could perhaps help him find answers, or at least give him a glimpse of something beyond the isolated, mundane life he had always known. But now, all of that felt so fragile, so fleeting. There was nothing more he could do. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, each beat echoing the desperation in his chest. What would happen now? What had he even hoped for? He couldn't save her, this alien girl, this dying creature who had fallen from the sky and entered his world with nothing but a promise of adventure. The weight of that loss pressed down on him as the alien's breathing grew more shallow. He could see it now. The end of her journey was near. Her eyes, once glowing with a radiant intensity, now looked dim and distant. Her once majestic, alien features were fading, and there was no denying the stark truth. She was slipping away. But then, as if some invisible force was urging him forward, he made a decision. A sudden burst of clarity struck him. The man's hands moved without thinking he wasn't going to let her die without a fight. He reached down, gently cupping her face in his hands, as though trying to hold on to the last bit of warmth she had left. "I'm not going to give up on you," he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips as a tear fell from his eye. His own reflection seemed to flicker across her unblinking eyes, a mirror of hope, fear, and longing. He didn't know why he had been drawn to her, or why she had been drawn to him, but he knew one thing for certain: she deserved better than this. Her hand twitched, a small movement that might have been unnoticed by anyone else. But to him, he saw the flicker of life in her once more. Maybe it was too late for a full recovery, but he would fight, even if it meant pushing beyond his own limits. He couldn't stand the thought of her passing without at least trying. He began to recall the fragments of knowledge he had gathered during their brief time together. The strange symbols, the cryptic language she had used, and the occasional flashes of communication between them. They had shared moments, brief but powerful exchanges that spoke of a deep, ancient bond between their two worlds. He couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to tap into that connection. If there was even a chance to reverse the damage, to heal her before it was too late. A wave of determination washed over him. He couldn't do it alone, but maybe there was something he could call on. He had heard of the mysterious network that stretched across the universe, an ancient group of beings. Some call them Watchers, others Guardians. They were said to have knowledge beyond comprehension, powers that transcended time and space. If there was any hope left, it would come from them. In that moment, the man made the fateful decision to find them. But how? He had no idea how to contact these guardians. He had no knowledge of where to find them, or if they would even help him. But he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. He had come this far. He wasn't going to turn back now. His fingers brushed over the alien's skin one more time, the faint pulse beneath it telling him that she was still clinging to life, however tenuously. He closed his eyes, pushing away his fear, and focused. His mind raced as he tried to connect with her in some way, anything that might give him a clue. And then, like a whisper, a voice soft and distant, but unmistakably clear, entered his thought. "Find the beacon," it said, almost as though the words had been embedded deep within his consciousness. He opened his eyes in shock. The alien girl's body shifted slightly, as though her very essence was pushing him forward, urging him to follow this new path. Was this the key he had been waiting for? A beacon? The man didn't hesitate. He had no more time to waste. With his newfound sense of urgency, he carefully lifted the girl into his arms, his resolve steeled. He would find this beacon. He would find the Guardians. And he would bring her back, no matter the cost. The world outside seemed to blur as he made his way through the dense forest surrounding his home. His heart was heavy with the weight of what he was undertaking, but there was no turning back now. The path was clear in his mind, driven by a single thought: he could not lose her. As he ventured deeper into the unknown, he began to feel an eerie sense of foreboding. The trees, once familiar, now seemed to stretch ominously toward the sky, their branches twisting in unnatural ways. The air grew colder, and the weight of the journey pressed down on him, as if the very earth was resisting his progress. But he pushed forward, step by step, with a singular purpose in mind. The beacon had to be found. The world seemed to shift around him. He could hear strange, otherworldly sounds in the distance, a hum that resonated through the very air. It felt as if the planet itself was alive, pulsing with energy, guiding him towards something. He didn't know what it was, but he couldn't stop. With each passing moment, the feeling of urgency became overwhelming. He was close. He could sense it. The girl in his arms felt warmer now, and though she was still unconscious, her body seemed to respond to his will. The beacon was out there. He just had to find it before time ran out. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, the air grew darker, the shadows stretching longer across the ground. He pressed forward, driven by the hope that whatever lay ahead would be the answer he had been searching for. The alien girl, the strange whispers, the promise of guardians. Everything was leading him to this moment. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A flickering light, faint but unmistakable, breaking through the thickening darkness. His heart skipped a beat. This was it. The beacon. He was about to make contact with whatever force lay beyond. But as he approached, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Was it too late? Would he find what he was looking for? The answers were still just out of reach, and the next moment would be the one that decided it all.